Well, welcome to the Wichita-Sedgwick County Historical Museum. I'm Eric Hale, I'm the museum director, and I thank you for being here today. We're pleased to bring you this program. It's possible through a grant to the museum by the Charles and Joanne McElwain Foundation. The McElwains were longtime members and supported the museum as volunteers and through this gift. We also thank Humanities Kansas for their Speakers Bureau and assembling so many wonderful programs, many of which we take advantage of, including today's. We also thank the City of Wichita and the Sedgwick County Board of Commissioners for their operational support and for all of those who are museum members who support us through membership. Now I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Diana Staresinic-Deane, who is the Executive Director of the Franklin County Historical Society and the Old Depot Museum in Ottawa, Kansas. These are museums very much like ours here, local history. We do not operate a museum in a depot, but you have some extra stuff there in Ottawa. Yes, we do have the old City Hall building, which this is where we've been, as many of you know, for almost 45 years now. The Franklin County Historical Society is actually 2 years older than the Wichita-Sedgwick County Historical Museum. We started in '39, and you guys started in '37, so you've got a couple up on us. But we're really pleased to have you here, and a lot of excitement and interest in your topic today. So help me welcome Diana, please.
All right, thank you very much. I am short, so this is right about the right height. So, did anyone come to the program I did for the local genealogy society a few months ago? Okay. Oh, fresh minds to work with here. Okay, let me just make sure our clicker is working here. Beautiful. All right. So, more? Yeah, all right. That's okay. My problem is I do tend to bounce around like a Muppet, so I may have to do that. Let me do that. All right. Okay. I point at things, and I'll just apologize if you're in the front row. I may get so excited about this topic, this microphone may go flying, so just be ready to duck if you need to. Okay, so my love affair with house history started with my love affair with ghost stories. I was 9, and we used to get those scholastic book brochures at school, and back then they always had a little section that was for like true crime and ghost stories, and I don't know how appropriate it was as a 9-year-old for me to be looking at pictures from the Lizzie Borden murder scene, but there we are, and here I am as a result. But I loved stories about reportedly true ghost stories, and if you go to my house, I have shelves of them that I've collected over the years. This happens to be the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. She was thought to be Lady Dorothy Walpole. She lived supposedly from 1686 to 1726. And supposedly she haunted this house in Norfolk, England, and in 1936, Country Life magazine was photographing the house. And they saw this visage coming down the stairs, and they took the picture, and there she is in all her glory. And to me, she actually looks a bit like those little Virgin Mary statues my grandma had in her front yard. But I loved her, and it wasn't because I loved the idea of a house being haunted, because I actually think there's something kind of sad about the idea of someone being trapped in their house for all of eternity, especially if they didn't want to be there. But I love the idea of this thing that transcended time and connected us to the past. And that really got me thinking about the spaces we're in, which is kind of lofty for 9. But I remember being really disappointed that our 1950s ranch house could not possibly have been part of the Underground Railroad. But it got me thinking about like who was on our property? How am I part of that story? And that's where it kind of got started for me. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to identify that space that we're on, the tools that are available, how to follow those breadcrumbs from one piece of information to another, and then how to take all of that and turn it into a narrative about your space and also where you fit into that narrative. So here's a really important idea I want you to embrace right now. Real people live real lives in real houses. You don't have to have a building as old as the one we're in. You don't have to have a notorious house. You don't even have to have a house. I mean, if you have a back 40 that you've pitched a tent in, that back 40 has a story. And so if you built your house in the 1980s, don't feel like this isn't worth your time, because the land that that house is on is much older than we are. And there's still a story to tell there, as well as everything that's happened since 1980. So don't be discouraged if you're not researching a Victorian mansion that had 3 homicides in it. So our first big question then is, where are you? And that sounds kind of like a glib question, but let's think about this. So this is a map of Pomona, Kansas. This is in Franklin County. It's about 10 miles west of Ottawa, and you will notice that there are street names in different colors. And that is because when 911 was implemented, we started making changes to street names to make them more logical, because it turns out when you're having a heart attack, you want to be able to give someone an actual address and not hope that the 20-year-old driving the ambulance knows to turn where Bob's barn was 30 years ago before it burned down. So they started doing a lot of changes to make street navigation easier. In Pomona, they changed the street names. They were originally East A, B, C, D, and they changed them to the name of former presidents. And so if you bought a house today on Taylor Avenue and you didn't know that, you would dead end on your research, because you wouldn't know that when you're in the newspapers, you might also want to be looking at East B Street. The most dramatic version I've seen of this is in Leavenworth County. It's a town called Baser. It's where my brother lives right now. So Leavenworth County butts up against Wyandotte County, which is Kansas City is just encroaching towards that line. And when Leavenworth County named all their rural roads, they recognized that. So at the edge of Wyandotte County, it was about 145th Street. They just kept going. They decided to just keep the numbers going into Leavenworth County from Wyandotte County. And then they get to the little town of Baser, and they're like, well, this is a problem, because it was one of those small towns that I think of as sort of a traditional Kansas town layout. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in one direction, and then your trees in the other, walnut, hickory, maple, those kinds of street names. Well, the tree names were going to be hitting right up against the street numbers coming in from the county. So what they decided to do was they rotated the map 90 degrees. And all of the tree names became numbers, but not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They continued, right, from the county. So 154, 155, 156. And then all the numbers, which used to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are now tree names. Walnut, hickory, maple. So my brother, who would have originally lived on like 5th Street, is now on Hickory Street, and that's very confusing if you're trying to research your property and you don't know that. So what we're really interested in thinking about is that legal description. How many of you have seen the legal description for the property you're thinking about? Okay, so legal descriptions are very cumbersome. This happens to be the legal description for the Ottawa Friends of the Library. Should you be wandering through Ottawa and have this desperate need for a used book, please stop there and support our library. But where do these descriptions come from? So, back in the early days, after settlement into what's now the United States, a lot of those descriptions for land looked like you owned land from the creek to your neighbor's barn to a big tree stump. What is wrong with those land descriptions? Go ahead. They'll change, right? The creek moves, the tree stump rots away, your neighbor's barn collapses. And so they realized in 1785 they needed to adopt something better, and they adopt the public land survey system. And they have these surveyors going out with these chains, measuring out section by section, township by township, with these chains that are 66 feet long. And they're basically making these grids, these beautiful, beautiful grids. And now it's more like playing Battleship. As long as you know your township and range, you can locate. And once you find that township, you can find the section. And it's very elegant. And this means that it doesn't matter if your county line changes. It doesn't matter if your city gets incorporated into another city. It doesn't matter if there is a reservoir that is put into your property. That spot on that grid is that spot on that grid. And so it's a very elegant solution to some of the land descriptions. Now, I have still seen some funky land descriptions. I think I saw one for Chase County that really did use a bur oak stump as a divider, which I'm sure has, landed someone into a headache at some point. But you have, one of your handouts is how to read those land descriptions. And I find that people who live in rural areas are much more comfortable with it because they're thinking of their property in quarter sections and townships and ranges. If you're in town, you're also probably thinking about lots inside developments or additions or the original city plat inside a section or township or range. So if this still doesn't make sense to you, let me know afterwards and we can practice a few, looking up a few things, and I'll show you how to do it. But it's not too bad. So where do you get this information? If you don't have your description yet, you can actually find it through your appraiser's website on your county page, because you can plug in your current address that you're looking for. And sometimes you can also look at it by a map as well. And then this is actually from your county's page here, and it will give you your legal description. The one place this doesn't work well is Johnson County, because they have abandoned most of their township descriptions and gone to just lots because it is so urbanized that they don't even think about their land in this capacity anymore. So it's a little more challenging there, but you can still do this here. So you've got your legal description, and now we're going on a field trip. We're going to the Register of Deeds office. Has anyone done any research at the Register of Deeds? Just a few of you. Okay, so here's the secret about your Register of Deeds. The Register of Deeds is the genealogist of the land. Their whole purpose and existence is to maintain that sort of genealogy of who owns that property, when the lines might change, any land easements, all of that. That's all they do. They live for this. And almost every Register of Deeds person I've ever met actually really likes helping people do research on their property. So if you've never been there before, my suggestion is call them up, tell them what you're doing, and they'll go, this is a really busy day. Don't come today, but let's do it tomorrow. And they will walk you through what resources they have to help you. And so in my county, we still have a lot of paper as well as digital. And so like in town, I'm in Ottawa. This is actually the page from where my house is. And so I am in Ottawa, in a section, in a township, in township and range, in an addition. And then here are the lots in the addition. And this is just the index page, and it shows, you can see the numbers 13579 up at the top, that little strip. Those are all the lots on my side of the street, okay? And then every time there's an X, something happened to that lot. And they're just listed chronologically. So I can go through and highlight every time my lots are mentioned. And then it tells me what happened, what volume, and what page to go find that piece of record that tells me what happened on my land. So I can just trace that all the way back. Now, your Register of Deeds may also say, we can just look all this up online. And that's fun too, but not as fun as touching paper, I'll be honest. But you can find it that way, and that will let you find things like everyone who's ever owned your property. Not necessarily the same as everyone who's ever lived there, but everyone who's owned it. You can figure out, for example, when your land was subdivided. If you built your house in 1990, it was probably formerly a farm or some other larger property, and you can figure out when that land was subdivided. You can figure out mortgages and sheriff sales. And there's a lot, if you see a sheriff sale on your land, you know there was some drama, right? Something happened. So there's something exciting to go look for in the papers. You can find out if there are leases or easements, and your Register of Deeds usually has some cool maps there on hand to look through. What you will never find out from the Register of Deeds office is when your house was built, because they do not care. You can sometimes find out, though, from old tax records when buildings were built, because what happens when you build a building on your property? Your taxes go up. So you can sometimes figure out when that happened just by looking at a quick jump in your tax rate, going, that was when that house showed up. So, is anyone here lucky enough to have an old abstract for their property? Yeah, those are gold, aren't they? So abstracts, back in the days of yore, before computers, when you bought a house or a piece of farmland or a downtown property, you got a sheaf of paper from the title company, and it basically had a reverse chronology of every legal thing that's happened to your property. And then when you sold your house, typically you either handed it off to the next owner, or you did what we did, and we just sort of squirreled it away and turned it over to the Historical Society because we didn't want it to get tossed. They stopped doing these in some places as late as the 1990s, but mostly by the 1980s, because they switched to more of a title insurance system, and they stopped doing these. Now, this has everything you can get at the Register of Deeds, but it also has any legal drama attached to your property. Was your house fought over in a divorce? It might be in your abstract. Or in the case of my property that I lived in Emporia, I don't know if you can see the names, but it involves Martin and Lorna Anderson. Who are my true crime people in this audience? Does anyone know who Marty and Lorna Anderson is? Who are they? That was the preacher and the church secretary. It was the big crime in Emporia in the 1980s. Tom Bird had an affair with his secretary, Lorna Anderson, wife of Martin up here. And they were both convicted of killing their respective spouses. It was a movie, a mini-series on TV called Murder Ordained, which was not very accurate, but very fun to watch. And it turned out they owned my house. Not the one they lived in. This was a rental property, and you're flipping through the pages. What you discover is they had 2 outstanding mortgages, and the renters bailed and owed them $2,000, which is a lot of money to me as a nonprofit employee now, but would have been a lot of money in the 1980s. And so you're like, oh, this might be some of the financial stress they were alluding to leading up to the destruction of their marriage. And it's right there in my abstract. So that was very exciting because this was dated in 81, and I believe the crimes were in 82 or 83. So this was a pretty fresh problem in their family, and that shows up. And legal documents like this are public record. Now, you will not find these at the Register of Deeds, but you can sometimes find them at your district court office too. So that's another place to look. Now, if you don't have an abstract, as I said, you can rebuild most of those documents at the Register of Deeds. Most Register of Deeds are really nice, and they let you bring your camera and you can just photograph them, so you don't even have to pay for the printouts. But you won't get these there. Can you get an abstract today? You could have one made by the title company, but I will tell you, having priced it, it can be $4 to $6 a page. And if you have a property that turns over a lot, you could easily spend hundreds of dollars doing this. And as you know now, you can find most of these documents at the Register of Deeds without a lot of charge. So the big question we get asked a lot when we're helping people research is, well, who owned my property first? And you notice there's a big asterisk there. And I point this out because Kansas opens up for settlement after the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Was Kansas vacant? No, it was not. There were a lot of people living here. They were living here and raising families here and working here and hunting here and worshiping here. And this was definitely not just a big sign at the front saying vacant, ready for occupancy kind of space. So even though we don't always know the names of the people who may have called the space where our homes are now their homes, There are resources to at least be able to say, I acknowledge that these people were part of the story of my property. A really easy one that I gave you on your handout, there is actually a great site that's been working on collecting all of the histories of all of the different tribes, both the people who were here just completely natively and then the immigrant tribes who were forced in. You can really just put in your zip code and it will kick up a list. You can just text this number and it'll give you a list of all of the tribes that were connected to your space. There are also some really great maps, I'm sure, here through the museum and also through the state, where you can also see where all the reservations were over time, the people who were here before the reservations were moved to this area. So please include that as part of the story of your land, because the land is so much older than 1854, and the people who were here so much earlier than 1854. So we'll go with then the question of, who did the government say the property belonged to first, which might be a reservation or it might not. In the case of my land for my house, it was deeded initially to the Ottawa tribe for their school, but it will be something different depending on where your land is. And before the pandemic, I'd say you'd have to get onto FamilySearch.org, and there are 72 volumes for Kansas, and you would literally have to flip through the pages using your township and range to find who owned that section first. During the pandemic, the Bureau of Land Management uploaded all of this data, and you can now search it either by clicking on the map or by putting in your section, township, range, and it will tell you every single homesteader or deed that was the original one that the government issued for that area, so that you can find that first person who was connected after settlements started. So for this area, one of the earliest ones that I was able to find was for someone named Eli Waterman. His land was granted April 1st, 1872. And it looks blurrier than it should, but you can pull these deeds up directly from the site, which is really nice. So there's a lot of information really easily available to you. A lot of it's online. And so we've got these legal descriptions. We've got all this information on some of those early landowners. And now I want to talk about maps. And maps is in the biggest letters I could fit on the screen because I love them with my whole heart. I can waste so many hours of my life looking at maps without looking for anything at all, because maps tell us a lot of things visually very easily in a way that sometimes text can't. So let's talk about some of the maps that can help you. So you remember these guys. And in fact, I found this awesome picture in your online collection of them surveying what's now Wichita. Look at this. This is right here where we are. And can you see what's in the background up there? You can see them? Okay. Yeah. Proof that, this land was not empty when they were out here surveying. But this was happening right here. So here they are surveying. And the really cool things that they did was they drew these maps. And they drew in, especially from the east. So they start surveying in about 1855, right after passage of that Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now picture these guys. They're pulling these chains. You got to keep them level. Sometimes they could use wagons to kind of mark it too, like the wheel of the wagon. But picture these guys pulling these chains 66 feet at a time up and down Kansas. And they started in the east from the Missouri border, the civilized area. And they kept going west. They're still surveying in the 1870s, getting out west, okay? So it takes a long time. And in the east, they're still really enthusiastic and they're drawing in anything interesting that they see. They kind of fizzle out towards western Kansas and they're just drawing squares. Sometimes they'll acknowledge there's a river, but they aren't nearly as interesting. So here we are in Sedgwick County, and let's look at some of the things we can see here. You're lucky enough? Oh, look, okay. So, can anyone see what this says? Can someone read that off right here? Indian Trading Post, all right. And then we've got some water here, right? What's this? That's a road, right? And then you've got all these little things. These are trees. They're so excited about trees because there weren't a lot of them in a lot of places. And so you can see there's some other indications of settlement, crossings. All this kind of information is just drawn in. There's another little road, and plus, of course, the section lines. And then there's this little, it's right here, a little trail here. Look, there's a ford. And if you look at some of the early maps, they actually put in their bridge there. So there's all kinds of information that informs you what was happening at this time, because this is from let me see, when's this map done? It was started in 1866 and finished in 1867. So we can already get a sense of who's here. We can see how it's going to shape Wichita, can't we? So there's a lot of information here. I've seen all kinds of cool things. Franklin County has abandoned Indian village. It has all these trails. And the trails itself, to me, is super interesting. I'm super interested in how people move through land, how it affects where we live, and then what happens when you move the road, which we do a lot, right? We shift the roads around. So we think of the big trails in Kansas. We think of the Santa Fe Trail. We think of the Oregon Trail. We think of the Chisholm Trail. We think of the Smoky Hill trails, but we don't think about, just the trails that connect forts and the trails that connect homesteads to other homesteads, and the trails that take you to the water, and the trails that, take you to little villages. So there's all these roads, and some of these roads are roads today, and some of these roads go through your dining room now. So it's something interesting to think about, how people move. And we'll look at this map. So this is one of my favorites. This is Gunn's new map of Kansas and the gold mines. It's from 1859, and you might be going, what gold mines? So where did Kansas Territory end? Colorado, that's right. So those were the gold mines. And then when the state was formed, we didn't get to keep the gold mines. But what's really awesome about this map is that it shows you a lot of the trails. It also shows you, what's Breckenridge? Breckenridge doesn't exist, right? But Breckenridge and Madison become Lyon County, where Emporia is, okay? So county names, again, we talked about these names can change, but you can see the reserves. Look at all the trails all over the place, connecting things. So there's a lot of information there about how people move around the land. And to just drive this home a little more, so we have I used to say we have 37,000 photos in our collection in Franklin County. And this last week, my staff, who is so dedicated, they literally dumpster dived because they heard the Ottawa Herald, which was leaving their office, threw away photos, and they dumpster dived and saved 16 crates of negatives. So I think 37,000 is now going to be more like 60,000. But we don't know yet because my staff, I'm just like, gosh, I hope you all have your vaccinations in place because they were jumping in that dumpster to get these photos. So now we're going to have more. But to date, we have 37,000. So this is Main Street Bridge number 3 being dedicated in Ottawa. And it's a cool picture, right? It's kind of a neat picture, but what's really exciting about this picture is what's happening in the circle. Cars. Why? That's the ford. Okay? That was the original ford, why people settled in Ottawa where they did, because the Meredithine River runs kind of through the middle of the county, and you have all these roads, these trails that are like an hourglass all across the county, and they funnel down to the ford and then spread back out. But the original ford was at what's now Hickory Street, not Main Street. After the levees are built in, this is totally gone. You can't ford this anymore like this. But we have some awesome pictures. That first bridge that was built, people were charging a toll, and you can just see the defiance of people using the ford instead of the new bridge because they're not going to pay money to cross the river. And so after, it didn't last very long. They didn't make a lot of money because all the traffic stayed on that ford except for when it was flooding. And Ottawa floods enthusiastically and often. So, it gets you thinking about people moving in your area in ways you didn't necessarily realize. So, plat books, who's looked at these? They're usually about yay big, they're kind of heavy. These are really fun. You can look at a lot of them online, and the handout I gave you does have those online resources. Sedgwick County, do we have some here in this building? Okay, so we've got some here. You may be able to find some at the Register of Deeds office. Oh, very nice. So if you want to have one that you can just touch whenever you want to, you can get your own reproduction. So the glorious thing about these books is, especially if you're researching land that is rural or used to be rural, right? So we'll look at, here is one for where we are. And what's interesting, remember we were talking about that little ford. Look, there's the little bridge where that ford used to be. Okay, so you can see a lot of information. We're going to zoom in, and let's look at some things we can see here. First of all, you had named islands in the middle of your river at one point. This is fascinating to me, and it belonged to someone, which seems really precarious to me because I imagine your river occasionally floods too. And you can see ownership, all these little squares. That's where the houses are or were, depending. You can see where the water was at that time. You can see the shape of Wichita at that time. Sometimes you can find some really cool stuff. You'll see racetracks. My favorite is near Fredonia. They draw on all their mounds, like this is our big hill here, that's our big hill there. You can see, sometimes you'll see windmills or coal mines or all kinds of other little features like that. And if you have a house that was maybe built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you know, back in the year that this map is from, which is 1882, it was probably a farm. So you might get a sense then of who owned it before and how big the land was, how big the ownership was. And you might also be able to get a sense, like you can see schools. So you maybe you had a school on your property. You can find cemeteries and a lot of other little features. And from a genealogy perspective, sometimes you can find out why people got married because you realize they had neighboring farms, or they probably went to the same school or the same church. So there's a lot of information, and these books, especially the early ones, they're art. They're just beautiful to look at. So there's a lot to be learned, and it sounds like you have a lot of access to be able to see these. All right, this is my personal passion. Who's looked at a Sanborn fire insurance map before? Aren't they wonderful? Yeah. Okay, so the Sanborn fire insurance maps were designed for a totally different reason than most maps. Most maps are like geographical maps, or they're street maps, or they have a lot of other purposes. Sanborn fire insurance maps were designed for two reasons. One was for insurance, to assess risk of fire, and the other was for fire departments to be able to assess how to protect cities and towns from fire by knowing where the water was and knowing the composition of materials that were used in houses. And the really glorious thing for Sedgwick County is that a lot of your cities have these Sanborn maps, and they're huge. I think I looked at Wichita, and like the newest one is 3 volumes with like 250 or 300 pages total. And they go into tremendous detail. So let's look at this. Okay. Do these streets still exist today? Have they been renamed? Okay, so this is, again, we're talking about those changes. So you're looking at yellow. Yellow is going to be wood frame structure. Okay, DWG is dwelling, but they'll also tell you what the businesses are for, and you can see porches and the little tags mark number of windows and where the doors are. Sometimes the chimneys are listed. Pink is going to be your masonry, your brick buildings. Blue is typically going to be stone. Sometimes it can also be used, depending on the maps, it can be concrete. Sometimes you'll see like a gray front. That's going to be that iron cladding that was really common on buildings. But notice they also draw in all the little buildings in the back, the outhouses, the sheds. All of this is fire risk, right? And then you can also see, so this map, just double check the year. So this is Wichita 1884. Bravo, you've got water lines. You can tell that. Right here, that's your water line, okay? And you'll see hydrants around. In Ottawa, if you look at our 1884 map, there's a blue circle behind almost every house. Those are wells. that used to be behind every house. And okay, I grew up as a middle schooler. Baby Jessica McClure fell down a well when I was in middle school. And I have a perpetual fear of falling down an abandoned well that I didn't know was there. And the Kansas City Times, which is a paper that doesn't exist anymore, they actually had this just little sidebar during this. It's like, well, Kansas has probably around 300,000 abandoned wells. And I think about this when I'm out walking on a lawn somewhere going, hope I don't find one. And in fact, when I was in Allen County, I had 3 different people tell me I fell down a well I didn't know was their story. I don't know what's going on in Allen County, but be really, really careful there. So there's a lot of information, and they really fairly accurately represent the building. So if you happen to be in an area represented by these maps, you can go turn the pages, and you'll notice on your handout I listed every single year that these maps were made for Wichita. You can flip the pages and just see how the buildings on your property change over time. And if there's a really drastic change, like the building just totally changes shape, not just an addition, but like really changes, you know something happened, and you know you're looking for something big. By about the 1930s, they stopped printing new maps, and they sent out these little paste-in corrections that you glued over. And they did this through about the 1950s, and it's really both glorious and frustrating because if you've got one from the 50s, you can see it's been glued many times, but you can't see under what was glued. So we have some of those. And here's the best thing. These are online. You can look at them through the Library of Congress website. You can look at them through the Kansas KU Spencer Library website. You can do this in your pajamas at 3 in the morning. You can look at them for hours looking for nothing at all. They're really wonderful. So that's where those are. So look at those. They will tell you about your neighborhoods. So those are the Sanborn maps. So we've learned a lot that we can get out of the maps. And now let's think about the people connected to your house. So who's played with census records? Yeah, and now we have 1950, but AI is doing a really horrible job reading cursive. They think there was only one Smith living in Franklin County in the 1950s. For shame. But there's a lot of information in census records that can inform your house. First of all, it tells you who actually lived there. Not necessarily the owner, but who actually lived there. But sometimes even who lived there can tell us why your house is the way it is. If the builder was a bricklayer and you have a brick house, this makes sense. If you have a house where you're like, why were these rooms not originally attached to you've got rooms with no doorways to the original house structure, sometimes you're going to find out it was a doctor's office or a lawyer's office or something where it was part of the property, but it wasn't part of the home, which was the case in my house. It belonged to a professor who saw students during office hours from his home. So that can sometimes inform what's going on too. So sometimes just knowing who lived there can give you a sense of why it's shaped the way it is. Now, sad story about census records. In 1890, the ones for Kansas burned up in a fire. This is why we should always back up data, right? And 1890 is a rough one for Kansas because so much change happened in Kansas from the 1880s to 1900. So it's a hard loss. We've got state census records for 85 and 95, but that 1990 is a tough loss. But there's still a lot of information available. Do we have city directories for Wichita? Yay, we're nodding. Okay, city directories are different than phone books because it's really a directory of every person and business, regardless if they had a phone, especially before there were phones. You can usually search them by name or by reverse address lookup. So again, you're doing all this research and you're figuring out what your address might have been back then. City directories do not always have that same commitment to accuracy. I've seen people resurrected from the dead 8 years after they died. But you can still get a lot of information, and where these are really helpful is if you're researching those downtown buildings that had lots of rental space because they came out every year. And sometimes that rental space changed over a lot. So you can get a lot of information from those city directories too. All right, other places you can find stuff: probates and wills, vital statistics. Through 1911, Kansas vital statistics, when the state took them over, they were no longer public data. Right? But before then, it is. Unfortunately, a lot of counties pitched their records. Johnson County unceremoniously destroyed all their marriage, death, and and divorce records because they were no longer legally obligated to keep them. But other places donated them to historical societies or libraries, so sometimes they're still around. Cemetery records, biographical files, yearbooks, places like this, museums and libraries. Now the State Historical Society has a lot online and in person, and today social media groups. Does Wichita have a you were from Wichita if kind of group? People post pictures of all kinds of things, and it may be a picture of something you need. So let's talk about pictures. And I'm speaking to the people who maintain these photos too here. It's really important to recognize how places get photos. If you come in and say, I would like to know if you have any pictures of 832 South Cedar, chances are good they'll go, we have 40,000 pictures, but shrug. Why? Why is this? So your grandma died, you live in California, and you have 2 weeks to clean out her house here in Wichita. And you're going to find a box of photos, and you're going to go, I don't know who these people are, but I feel really guilty throwing them away. So you're going to sheepishly bring it to your historical society and say, here's a gift. And the historical society will both cringe and be grateful. I'm seeing nods. And they will do the best they can to identify what they can. But it might have your grandparents' name in front of their first house, but you don't know what the first house was. But you've been researching. You have been digging through all this data at the Register of Deeds, and you've come across their name attached to your house. And now this is where you and the Historical Society help each other, because you can give the names that you are looking for too. And they'll go, oh, we have Bob and Martha Smith in our records with a house, and it says first house, and you will look at that picture and go, that's my house. And they'll go, really? And you will give them your address, and now their records get better too. So there are ways to help each other, but sometimes we have to get creative in the meanwhile. So let's look at some pictures. So here's a picture of a flood on Douglas Avenue looking west from Emporia Street in 1904. And that's all it says about the picture, right? We don't have addresses in here, but these are obviously buildings on Emporia Street, and there's a lot of information about these buildings in this picture. We can see what they look like. We can see how they were used. We can see that they're in a floodplain. So there's a lot of information in this photo. You won't find it by looking for your address, but you'll find it if you think a little bit more creatively. If you are someplace that floods, has had a tornado, or a major snowstorm, or an ice storm, or a windstorm, or a truck crash through a window, there will be pictures. In Ottawa, we flood enthusiastically and often. They always close the Main Street Bridge first because it's lower than the Prairie Spirit Trail Bridge, which is the old railroad bridge. So I swear it is a town event for all of us to pile onto the railroad bridge to take pictures of them closing the gates on the Main Street Bridge. It's a very well documented phenomenon. So whenever parades, if you're on a parade route, you're in luck. So you never know when we'll find those photos. Speaking of parade routes, here's another picture. It says the Midian Temple Band Parade, somewhere between 1908 and 1911 here in Wichita. Same thing, it's a picture of the parade, but it's also really a picture of what it's a preserved moment in time for that city block. Okay, here we have Elvin Corey's Barber Shop in Bentley, Kansas, 1912. It's a glorious interior photo. We don't have a lot of these from the early years. It's hard to photograph in the dark or when you can't do a lot of lighting, but oh my gosh, you can see the pattern on that floor. Isn't that wonderful? So this could be your building. And you wouldn't know that unless you knew that it used to contain Elvin Corey's Barber Shop because there's no address attached to this. Now this is a real gift. This is a picture of a building being built. A bank. This is Bentley Bank under construction in 1909. We don't get a lot of these. Most people wait till the building's done to take the picture, so this is actually kind of a gift. This is one of my favorite photos I've ever come across. This is not local exactly. This is from Blaine, Kansas. Blaine's in Pottawatomie County, so we're kind of going north central Kansas. Brother Walter and myself at his spring near his house near Blaine, Kansas. It's from an album of breweries and bootleggers. It's from 1907, and that's a big old thing of Schlitz right there in the spring. So if you know that someone named Walter owned your property near Blaine, this might be your field and you may still have Schlitz in there, I don't know. But you might still have that spring, and here's this really great story connected. Another interior, this is Joseph and Josepha Fuchs Herbert in the town of Ellis, in the county of Ellis in Kansas. That's out like towards Hayes, 1896. We learn a lot about these people. This is a picture of them, but it's a picture of their house too. You can see what it looks like. You can see what they value, right? There's a lot of information there about their space. All right, this one is more local here. It's near Mount Hope, 1884. Edmund, Edith, and Emma, I believe it's Whiting. And if you know that name is your property, here's information about what that property looked like. And finally, why this picture, you're wondering? It doesn't look like a building, and yet it does. So, pharmaceutical salesman for McKesson Potts, 117 North Santa Fe. It was shot sometime in the 30s, 40s, maybe even 50s. They were pretty generous on the time period. Why would I include this photo? So yeah, you get a little bit of information about the building behind them, but what else do you get information about in this picture? In the reflection. Look at those glass plate windows. If the light's hitting right, sometimes you can see what's across the street, and sometimes that may be all you have to work with for a starting point, but it can confirm what was across the street at the time the picture was taken. So sometimes you can get some information there just to help you identify a time period, even potentially make this a narrower time period on this photo. If you go, oh, I know that thing in the background was torn down by this year, then you can kind of narrow down that time period. But sometimes you can see really good reflections in those glass plate windows. And sometimes we're not looking for photos at all. This is a drawing of the Caldwell House Hotel. It's by Ada Junius. This is Sumner County, 1876. Now, he was a cartographer who was hired to follow the military around. In the 1870s. He drew a lot of amazing maps, but he also did sketches, and he journaled, and you can read his journals online. I really love how he just sort of name-dropped sitting on the same train with Wild Bill Hickok in the middle of his journal. Is this a great photo of great drawing of Caldwell? No. But what does it tell us? It gives us a sense of how fast this has grown, right? Because, look, there's a well and a little log structure behind kind of a more fancy hotel. And so it's giving us a sense of just what that community looked like and that street looked like in 1876. So if you are researching that block, it gives you information. Okay. And be on the lookout for real photo postcards. Once the post office started letting you make your own postcards, cameras came out that were designed to help you make these pictures. And there are a lot of them where there are just a few of them out there. I was in an antique store, and I bought this one for 99 cents plus tax. And I'll be honest, I bought it for the passive-aggressive language on the back of the postcard. Dear Kennedy, what is the matter with you? I have written you twice and Johnson once, and we never hear from you. This is my grandma right here. But then it goes on to talk about, what do you think of this new building? It's all concrete except for the ceiling and the roof. So I start researching this building. It was in Ottawa. It was actually built by a woman named Belle Alex, and her sister would go on to own another. They were real estate moguls here in the early 1900s. The Pettit Tin Shop was in there for a long time. Then it became a creamery. And then one of those many, many floods finally took out the building in the 1930s. And I found this story, its origin story, by accident in an antique shop for 99 cents plus tax. So you never know when you'll find something like that. And then newspapers. This is where I get on my pedestal and say, please subscribe to your local newspaper because they're really important historically, not just in the present day. I can tell you when the man who built my house had a carbuncle on his neck because it was in the paper. But no one will know what I am doing with my whole year now in the paper. And it's really scaring me to think that with all of this digital media we have, in 20 years, 40 years, 50 years, they will have no idea what we were doing because it'll all be gone. So subscribe to your local paper and keep it going. But in the meanwhile, take advantage of where all these historic papers are. The State Historical Society has worked with newspapers.com to make everything up through 1923 free, and that most counties had dozens, if not more, of papers. So there's a lot of information, and the glorious thing about littler town papers is everyone's business is everyone's business. So they're really fun. And you can also look at them on microfilm in a lot of places still, but they're not as searchable. But you have collected all these addresses, all of these names, all of these events, all of these things so far, and you can look all of this stuff up in these early papers and see if you can find those connections. And remember that buildings move. This is a great photo of a building just chugging down Main Street in Ottawa. They move buildings sometimes miles and miles over trails because why waste good materials? Materials are expensive. It's a perfectly good building. It can be reused. And so, you know, if you find out your building moved, you have a whole other story to go look for, don't you? So also, finally, look at those stories in your neighborhood, because you never know if there was a car crash in front of your house. If your neighbor's house burned down, your house may be in the picture in the background, you know? So look for those stories too. So how do we put all this together? We've got all this information, and I'm going to just kind of go through quickly the history of my own house to sort of show you how we can gather all this information and then use it to tell a story. Now, I will tell you, this is the old part of the house that came from somewhere else, and this is the new part. So I have a Franken house, okay? And I used this photo, even though we've replaced the porch after my husband fell through it. The porch is still the same shape, but honestly, this is the last time I bothered with landscaping, and I don't look like the neighbor that you called zoning on. So this is why we still have this house. Actually, you can see that board. See that board right there, the replacement board? Yeah. So, we kept the shape of the porch. So this is my house. So let's look at all the stuff I've collected. So the property, we talked a little bit. It was originally part of the land that was for the Ottawa Indian tribe, and we know that from those early homestead records because they had deeded it to the Ottawa. Robert Atkinson was on the board of trustees for Ottawa University. They gave up that land in exchange for making a university. 20 minutes later, the Ottawa were kicked out of Kansas. But if you are a member of the Ottawa tribe, you can go to the university for free still today. Robert Atkinson ends up with the land. It changes hands a bunch of times. They played a lot of weird games with land to drive the tax levels up, where they changed hands a whole bunch of times, and it goes in a sheriff's sale, and then they start over. When he dies, we've got his probate records. So we know that he had up for grabs a pretty good chunk of land, horses, cattle, hogs, and farm implements. And his daughter, Margaret Topping, ends up with the land. She did not want it. She sold it to this handsome fellow. This is Grant Crane. Grant Crane is a character. And we've got the deed where she sold him this land. And Grant Crane was from a really early Franklin County family after it opened up for settlement. Started out in Peoria. He becomes a teacher. He marries Miss Laura Shively. Look at that lovely little bit in the paper wishing them unbound success and happiness. And he moves to Richmond, which is about 20 minutes, I should say, south of Ottawa. He starts the high school there. Then his wife dies, and he ends up moving to Ottawa, where he gets his master's degree through Gem City Business College, a correspondence school, which I thought was made up, but then I've run into other people who also got their degrees from this made-up, possibly, school. And he becomes this really amazing professor. And back then, his job was to help people enroll, to teach them, and then to help them get jobs. So he's traveling all the time. One of his students holds the world's speed record for typing and is actually performing at like 239 words a minute on a manual typewriter at the exposition in St. Louis, okay? So his students are doing amazing things. He's traveling, travels to Kansas City a lot, but file this away because it becomes more important in the story than it should. So OU's administration building, literally the night before the grand opening of the new administration building, burns to the ground. He runs in trying to save a lot of his own stuff. He actually loses $1,200 of his personal items, and he comes out with one typewriter, which actually, when you think about what those typewriters weighed back then, is still pretty impressive. I have an Oliver number 9. It's like 30 pounds of cast iron. And he ends up then, he had divided up that land that he bought. He bought basically half a block, and he divides it up, and he buys a house from R.S. Black on Locust Street and moves it a few blocks over to where it is now. And it's really good for the house because later that year, it would have been very underwater. It was in a total flood area. 1903 was a nasty flood. So he moves it, and notice there's no address where he moved it, but we just know, we've run into Grant Crane. We're following his story. He's on Cedar Street, and we know where it came from. We know it dates back to at least the 1870s because there it is on one of those bird's eye view maps. Here it is in the Sanborn map for 1884. Notice the pesky well. And he moves it, and here it is in the 1930s. And hilariously, I found this picture totally by accident. When I started working at the Old Depot Museum, I was literally vacuuming, and I look up, I'm like, that looks like my house. And I go, that is my house. Look at the gingerbread. I wanted to put the gingerbread back on my porch. It was going to cost $15,000. And I work for a nonprofit, so that's not going to happen. So, but here's some things we can learn from this picture. The house pretty much has kept its shape, right? Except there's a front door here that doesn't exist anymore. This would swing right into my husband's head in the bedroom. And we do not currently have stairs coming out of our shower. So there's some changes that have happened. So that the picture gives us some clues that something's changed. But we see little bits like this in the paper about it being papered and some changes being made. So we know he moves in because of the city directory. And then there's this little bit about Christmas in Lawrence and Ruby Macy spending Christmas in Lawrence. And then I found a marriage license for Lawrence at Christmas. And here's Ruby Macy. Here's the thing, they tell no one. Why? Oh, let me go back. Let's look at this marriage certificate. How old are they? 42 and 18, maybe. Okay? She is his student. They tell no one. So he's got ambitions. We're going to build a new business college. It's going to be modern. It's going to be amazing. We'll teach them all the latest things, stenography, all these other things that they really needed. And she graduates, so now they tell people they got married at Christmas, but not which Christmas. Okay? So, meanwhile, the building construction gets delayed. Why? Because of the Johnson-Jeffries fight. Who knows what the Johnson-Jeffries fight was? Any boxing fans in here? So it was a pretty important match. It was in Reno, Nevada in 1910. Johnson was a black heavyweight champion. Jeffries was a white heavyweight champion. Johnson won, and most movie theaters would not play the films. Okay? And it caused riots and strikes all over the country, including in Ottawa, Kansas. They refused to continue working on the building until they used it as a means to strike. Building gets built. It's still standing there. There's these great ads. There's stories about Grant Crane throwing candy out the windows to get people's attention, about boxcars full of furniture being hoisted through the windows on the second floor for this business college. Everything's really great and exciting. It's going to be wonderful. And then this happens. So remember those trips to Kansas City? That's another former student, Ethel McKee. And she thought that they were engaged, and she found out that they were no longer engaged when news of his wedding was posted at the holidays, but not the right holidays. So she thought they'd been engaged that whole time and was just waiting. He was sending her letters. She sues the bejesus out of him. Best time in Franklin County ever, because this is when people went to court for entertainment purposes. And look at these headlines. They read 300 letters on the stand that he wrote to her. And they are glorious because, coincidentally, he is saying, here's what I'm doing with the house. Here's what this room is for. Here's what the addition is for. Here's when we put in the gas line. Here's when we put in the phone line. And why was he telling her all this? He was sending her to buy furnishings for a house she would never set foot in. Oh, she does win this case, by the way. She gets money. We wish her very well. because it was not until the court case that she found out they had not been married for 6 months, but they had been married for a year and a half. That was her life wasted. But the city forgives him, and his business continues to do well. This is probably why I no longer have a carriage house in my backyard. He drove his car into it. And then he dies in my living room after breakfast one morning. And then Ruby starts running the business, which moves to where Chamber of Commerce is. We know that she's the manager. And then her mother dies in what I use as my office upstairs. And then we know that she becomes a woman of her heart, the Register of Deeds. And the business college is handed over to management with someone else. It pretty much dissolves by about World War II. And now we know she's maybe hitting some hard times because she's renting out the upstairs. Okay? And that probably explains why some of the walls are where they are today. And then she has some health issues, and she moves to Neodache. She sells the house. And she had previously sold off a little chunk to pay for some inheritance taxes. And so that is why the neighbor behind me has a backyard that's about 6 feet deep. But that's their house back there, and she sells off the rest. So all that history is packed in to a very little time frame. She, by the way, goes on to live until 1982, and there's still people who remember her, which is pretty amazing. So that is how you can take all of that data and tell this amazing story and think about what the neighbors were doing, and I'll think about the story that you are adding to the house. And so I've got this, little album that I've made, so if we ever go to sell the house, I have a copy of it. I'll leave it for the people who buy the house, and I'll just stick in whatever we did at the end so they've got that story to add to it. So that is why I love house research, because this is not just a story about architecture. It's a story about all the crazy things people do. And everybody has some level of story. You may not be lucky enough to have this massive trial attached to your house, but people are still amazing and do amazing and wonderful and weird things. So with that, I would love any questions that you have, or I can also stay for a few minutes afterwards if you just want to talk to me directly. So. Sometimes it shows up in the newspapers. Sometimes the sale of the house shows up in the newspapers. Sometimes it's a complete mystery. That is absolutely true. Especially when you're looking at some rural spaces, it doesn't always make the papers, but you might be able to find it just by checking the papers and looking at the ownership. Like, it doesn't always say, I bought a house from this address, but it might say I bought this structure from a person, and then you can figure out where that person was living or what they owned. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Okay. Okay. So when was 400 expanded? So that's pretty recent. So I'll turn to our experts for local history. Do you have any thoughts? Okay, because if the land was purchased, right, probably from where the house was, you might be able to figure out when they sold off that land and be able to narrow down the time frame. So there are resources, places to look. So if you can kind of narrow down then maybe which properties went up for sale at that point, you might be able to narrow down where it came from. And check the papers, start digging for photos. A lot of times in situations like this, they're going to list all the properties being purchased to. They'll probably take pictures of the areas about to be affected because it would be a human interest story. It'd be dramatic. You might be able to spot your house in those photos. 80s is far enough back where there was still a really vibrant newspaper. You might be able to find it there. Yes. Yes. Take off a couple of days from work and research really hard while it's still free. Yeah. And again, if you have those groups on Facebook that look at history, if you're feeling brave, you can take a picture of the front of your house and just say, I know this came from this area. Does anyone who was here in the 1980s recognize it? And see if you can crowdsource some information. Got it. Okay. So, but it sounds like you need to connect with the genealogy departments and see what they might be able to help you with. Okay. Anything else? Okay. I can hang out for a few minutes if you need me to. So thank you so much.